I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast about Sooty, who was on television for a very, very long time and was, and hopefully is, extremely famous. And when we were a bit younger, quite a lot younger really, they would have documentaries on television and remembering episodes of the current TV show, going right back to the 1950s. And they would tell you the story of when Harry Corbett bought a plain white teddy bear glove puppet
At the end of the North Pier in Blackpool for 7 shillings and sixpence.
and to make the bear look a bit more interesting, blacked his nose and ears with soot and therefore called it Sooty, and ended up using him in his magic act, which led to him getting on the television. And it was a very, very long time indeed, a little over 50 years, before Sooty was taken off the television.
Harry Corbett bought that puppet in the summer of 1948, which is also the same year Matthew Corbett was born, earlier in March. And the story goes that he bought the puppet to amuse his children, particularly his infant son. And I always thought it was rather fun to spot that in many ways Matthew and Sooty are pretty much the same age. Sooty debuted on television with Harry in 1952, and they first had their own television series in 1955 on the BBC. 1957 saw the first appearance of Sweep. 1964, the first appearance of Sue, who of course at the time was not allowed to touch Sooty, so that there wasn't anything sexual on children's television. That's a point we'll come back to in just a moment. In 1968, the Sooty show moved from the BBC to ITV, where it was produced by the quite newly formed Thames Television until 1992, which was really the last series of the Sooty show under that title. Matthew Corbett took over as the main human presence, the keeper of Sooty on the Sooty show in 1976. But it's not surprising to learn that he'd done plenty of puppeteering and little bits for the Sooty show before then, as well as appearing on very early episodes of Rainbow with Rod and Jane as Rod, Matt and Jane. And indeed Harry Corbett made sporadic appearances still on the Sooty show until 1984, so there's some overlap there. But 1976 is when Matthew took over as Sooty's main human friend and keeper. And then a particularly interesting point for me when I look up these Sooty dates is to realise that in 1981 Matthew decided to take the show into a more sitcom-y area than it had ever been before by moving to the Sooty's cottage instead of studio and live audience-based stuff, and make this kind of Sooty sitcom in the cottage. And that's what we're really used to from when we were very young. That's what we came into and enjoyed first of all. Matthew, Sooty, Sweep and Sue living in the cottage together and having a fun kind of sitcom. 1981 was also the year that Matthew's mum, Marjorie Corbett, stopped voicing Sue, and if you hear Sue from those first 16 years or so, and you're more used to Brenda Longman, who took over the role in 1981, it is striking that Marjorie Corbett as Sue sounds quite old and raspy and like the long-time smoker she was. One episode in 1990 saw the debut of Little Cousin Scampy, and we remember that very well. We were watching the show at the time. And then, as I said, in 1992 there was the final series of The Sooty Show. And it was also the end of Thames Television as an ITV franchise, and Sooty was taken over by Granada Television in Manchester. It made 6 series of Sooty & Co. from 1993 to 1998, when Matthew retired at 50 in 1998. Then there were 2 series of Sooty Heights, 1999 and 2000. We'll go into more detail about these later, of course. And then 3 series of just Sooty Heights, but not Sooty Heights, as we can be heard calling it, from 2001 to 2004. And then for the first time in just over 50 years, Sooty was off the telly. And he wasn't back on the telly again until 2011, and since that time, Sooty, Sweep and Sue and Richard Cadell have had 3 sporadic series, and that's the history of Sooty on television in a nutshell.
The character of Sooty basically is that he's a naughty, mischievous little bear. His first ever theme song included the lyrics "Ever so naughty Sooty," and we did fairly recently watch some clips on YouTube of Sooty mucking about with Harry Corbett, which actually didn't happen to include the sorts of things I was expecting, like hitting him on the head with a hammer, which sometime in the second half of the 20th century caused a child to severely damage his father by hitting him on the head with a hammer, and then Sooty wasn't allowed to do that any longer. There was a bit with the water pistol, I remember. There was a putting Sooty to bed sequence where Harry was trying to read him a story and he kept getting up and wanting this and that. So I suppose that's quite naughty. There was also one where he was going to box Butch, the sort of bulldog puppet, who I believe was a kind of recurring character back in the 60s and 70s. And it was kind of little sketches like that, some of them involving Sweep later on, some of them involving Sue later on. And we were very surprised and quite amused in the boxing episode that Sweep congratulated Sooty on his win by repeatedly kissing him on the lips. And we were going, good heavens, that's not sexual according to people in those days then. Imagine if Sue did something like that, they'd be banned. And we were having a bit of a laugh at how times have changed.
Sooty and Sue aren't allowed to touch at all at that stage, and yet in this episode Sooty and Sweep kissed each other on the lips. Obviously, nobody thought there was anything remotely sexual about that at the time, and I'm sure they were right.
Although it isn't as if boys do that with their friends. It was an interesting artistic decision, but obviously Sooty and Sweep have a very close friendship. You already mentioned Sue's voice. Perhaps we ought to talk about the different levels of voice they have at this point. Sooty quite famously whispers to his adult, sometimes to Sweep or Sue or other people down the line, because if you're doing a one-man show with a puppet, as Harry Corbett was, and you don't happen to be a ventriloquist, which Harry Corbett was not, that's how the puppet's going to talk to you, isn't it? And then as the whole thing grew and they had the idea of introducing Sweep, they had more people involved, they had more hiding places involved, and they could think of some different things to do to give the character a puppeteer and to give the character a voice. And in a very early clip that we watch on YouTube involving Sweep, I thought the puppet had a much doggier face than he would soon get, actually. And also the squeak that Sweep speaks with was rather sort of bark, 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 bark sounding, and we were saying, is that the famous saxophone reed? That's not how he's going to end up sounding. From some time in Harry Corbett's day, probably quite early on, to the present, you can hear the same voice achieved with a saxophone reed by Sweep, where he can do all these different inflections and pitches and sing with it, which is very unlike the bark, 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 bark kind of squeak he was giving Harry Corbett when he was in hospital with a bandaged ear. And we kind of wondered if it was a sort of simple thing you could do with a saxophone reed, and then they managed to develop it, or if it actually wasn't a saxophone reed but nobody remembers that, because whenever you read about it, all it will say is Sweep's voice is a saxophone reed, and it's not quite as explainable as Sooty whispering. It seems like quite a strange idea to think of. Perhaps they didn't think he ought to have a proper voice, a human voice.
It was very interesting to spot how it obviously is supposed to be the sound of a dog barking first off, but it doesn't particularly make you think of that if you pick it up later like we do.
You don't think it's at all strange, although you may notice the different degrees of speech right up to Sue speaking English at a perfectly audible volume. Of course, everyone understands every word Sweep says, and a lot of the time, with context, we, the audience, can understand him. When Sue is there or Matthew is there, they will translate for us, and a lot of it we don't actually need. And once or twice we even said, well, he didn't say that actually. He didn't say, keep going, Sooty. He said, go on, Sooty, for instance. And then there's that one scene involving Little Cousin Scampy, who also whispers. Makes sense because he's Sooty's blood relative. It's a family thing, and also when Matthew thought of him, they didn't need to bother about any kind of voice. And Sweep is bribing Scampy to put talcum powder on him so that he will look pale and ill, which is very funny in itself because he doesn't look pale and ill. He looks like he's got talcum powder all over his face, including in his eyes. But you can understand every word Sweep says without any translation at all. Hello, Scampy. Come here, come here. Gets out these sweets and says, that's for you, and that's for you. And then with the talcum powder, you put that on me. Whenever Sweep is doing a scene by himself, or Sooty is doing a scene by himself, or they're together, there isn't a speaking character. Matthew will translate in voiceover and often interact with the puppet, particularly Sweep. He responds to what the voiceover is saying. But that scene needs absolutely no translation, and Matthew Corbett knew it. He was very good at judging what children would like, what children would understand, what children would engage with, and that's one of the episodes from the 1991 series, which we have decided is the absolute apex of the peak of Sooty.
We always have plenty of praise for Matthew when we watch the episodes of Sooty that we still have on video from all those years ago, and rightly so. He really did a wonderful job writing, presenting, performing the Sooty show, Sooty and Co. as well. Not to mention the stage shows and the educational videos and so on for 20 years. One thing that always struck me about Matthew, and I was mentioning it this time, was how he's not always simply the parental figure. Obviously, particularly in the sitcom, his default position would be the parental figure, like Jeffrey and Rainbow. But actually, a lot of humour comes from the fact that Matthew can be just as much of a silly, spoiled child as the puppets themselves. You get a lot of storylines, getting a lot of humour from Matthew's boasting, Matthew's sulking, and the way he performs these things is extremely funny. You might just as well see the puppets tutting at him doing something extreme and stupid as him having to deal with them doing something extreme and stupid. And I always liked that about Matthew. We found an interview on YouTube with Brenda Longman talking to Richard Cadell when they were just going to relaunch Sooty on telly in 2011, mentioning how that was something special that Matthew brought to the show. He was like one of the children, one of the sources of chaos, wouldn't always be just there to clean up the mess and say, "Oh, you lot are all so naughty, aren't you?" like Jeffrey on Rainbow would do. Indeed, sometimes in the Sooty show, it's Sue who becomes the most grown-up parental figure, telling Matthew off for boasting and sulking and shouting at Sweep and things like that. And indeed, I do think Sue has a lot of swapping between those kinds of roles, like Matthew himself does, really. In some ways, Sue reminds me of Rose from Upstairs Downstairs, whose actress we mentioned last time, Jean March, when we were talking about the Tomorrow People. Rose can fit just as well and willingly into the silly mucking about, not really respecting the system servants, as she does often into the prim and proper, this is the way things should be, upstairs and downstairs in their place servants. And in the same way, Sue could be naughty and giggling, doing just as much havoc as Sooty and Sweep or Little Cousin Scampy, or she can be completely the mother figure and telling Matthew off. And I think I always liked that about Sue when I was little. You were talking about the one where Sweep pretends to be ill, and it was really striking me in that one while we were watching it. Most of the time, Matthew was in the parental figure role, saying to Sweep, "You've got to do your homework."
Not that they normally go to school, but never mind.
And of course, Matthew's the one Sweep has to persuade he's ill. And I was thinking, watching that one, oh yes, Matthew's really in the parental figure role throughout. But then, of course, at the end of the episode, what Matthew does, and what Jeffrey from Rainbow would never do, is then copy the idea himself and try and fake an illness by drawing spots on himself and get Sooty, Sweep and Sue to wait on him when he's not really ill. Which is rather fun and perhaps quite relatable for the young audience, and a refreshing thing to see from an adult on television. And I don't think Harry Corbett ever really did that sort of role as the main adult. Indeed, as we were noticing, Sweep and Sue in the 70s, and I'm sure before that, were addressing him as Mr. Corbett.
We could understand that Sweep was saying Mr. Corbett before Sue came along and said it in English. Another thing Matthew does that we always enjoyed is an awful lot of slapstick. It's really taking the water pistol and the pieing and the face to new heights. The way he gets absolutely covered in stuff, absolutely soaked through with water. It's a very funny sequence where Scampy has magicked Matthew's left hand, which has become naughty and drags him out onto the street and alarming members of the public by squirting himself with water, throwing these bags of flour, apologising to people. I'm sorry, I've got no control. That must have been very surprising for them. He would go out into the community and make a complete tit of himself. And not just anybody could pull that off. There was something very, very special about Matthew and his performance.
There's that memorable scene from Sooty and Co. going out into the community where the puppets have given all his clothes to Mo for a jumble sale.
Sue was very much in a child role there, of course.
And Matthew's rushing around Manchester city centre shopping area with this bath towel and shower cap and loofah and things, asking the general public if they've seen his clothes. What fun to come across that.
Not just anybody could get away with that. You have to be as famous as Matthew Corbett for doing what it is that he does.
You mentioned Matthew's narration there. One thing we always noticed about it was that once we got to Sooty and Co., the Matthew narrator persona became Matthew himself. Whereas in the Sooty show, the Matthew narrator persona was kind of like a separate character. If he wanted to talk about himself, Matthew the character in the show, he would say Matthew in the third person. Whereas when we got to Sooty and Co., it was always I and me. Well, you saw what Sooty and Sweep did to me just now. And we didn't talk about that difference for years. But one time we were watching Sooty and Co., and I asked Rosie whether she thought there was any real difference between Matthew being a separate persona for the narrator or just saying I and me. And you told me how much you hated him going to the first person of his narration. And then this time when we were watching some episodes of Sooty and Co., we were discussing how it doesn't work nearly so well.
When you asked me that and I said, oh, I hate it, and you were very surprised I felt so strongly, I couldn't have put my finger on why. I just always kind of felt that it didn't work as well. But once you really think about it, it's obvious. For one thing, Matthew in the first person has to be looking back, narrating retrospectively, so it doesn't make sense for him to interact with Sweep and the other puppets in the narration, and then that really makes him slip into present tense. Oh, what are you doing, Sweep? And then in the very next scene, Matthew in person won't know anything about it.
We watched Sooty's birthday, what's really his 50th birthday, from 1998, the final series of Sooty and Co., and voice Matthew, narrator Matthew, saying, that's the card I gave you for your last birthday. Oh, is it your birthday, Sooty? And then in the next scene, real Matthew still has no idea it's Sooty's birthday, and narrator Matthew is going around the house saying to Sweep, oh, it's Sooty's birthday, did you know? And we're like, well, is that Matthew or not? It would work much better like in the old Sooty show, if the disembodied voice that sometimes talks to you around the house was a separate character.
In the episode with the haunted hotel room, which we have on video from a bit before I can really remember watching it religiously, there's just one bit for a joke where Matthew himself interacts with the voice when it says things that will make his hair stand on end. What's left of it, and Matthew's like, hey, oh, sorry. Which shows that Matthew at least sometimes is aware of this voice. Sweep will talk to it very often. Sooty will kind of nod and shake his head to it sometimes. But it's not a thing that they talk about, that they really acknowledge to each other. It's just a device for the audience, which is very effective, I think.
We always laugh about that bit on Sooty and Co. where a game of hide and seek is in progress and it's turned into Mo's uncle, Stuart, has been lost, but Sweep doesn't know that, and everyone else is looking to find lost Uncle Stuart, and Sweep thinks they're just still playing a normal game of hide and seek. Narrator Matthew says, Sweep still has no idea this is nothing but a normal game of hide and seek. And Sweep responds by saying, no, I don't.
And then just gets on with it. We love that, and it's really been built up to over decades. He will often say, no, I'm not. Yes, I am. Yes, I do. No, I don't. To this voice, for instance, in that Faking an Illness episode, Sooty and Sue are doing their homework, and Sweep is kind of puzzling over his book, and the narrator tells us Sweep really isn't one for homework, and Sweep says, no, I'm not. Sweep's so cute and he's so funny. I really noticed this time around in that 1991 series, particularly when Matthew has written the episode, he really will very often have Sweep doing something completely wacky and save it up. Quite soon we'll talk about Derek, Sweep's friend. In Derek's second episode, which is in that 1991 series, we have to wait for Sweep looking for another Derek, trying to get various plastic ducks for the bath to interact with him. The best and clearest and most memorable example that I can think of, though, is the car boot sale. Sooty and Sue are getting stuff together for the car boot sale, and meanwhile Matthew is discovering that all the boots and shoes in the house are missing. And it's quite a little while, a few minutes, that he finds Sweep in the attic with all the shoes in the house and a load of toy cars for the car boot sale.
That's quite common humour for Sweep, taking things rather too literally, getting the wrong end of the stick, and it just adds to him being rather sweet. And like Megabyte, you often end up saying, oh, that's sweet.
The next stage is that Matthew tells him, well, you can sell anything at a car boot sale, Sweep, so he goes around the house, specifically into the bathroom, to just pick up anything, and he's pulling all the plumbing out of the wall and stuff like that. He's taken that much too literally as well. They are very plot-based, those episodes that were on when we were young and we considered to be the peak. It was interesting on Old School Weekend to see an episode set at the Sooteries.
I'm pretty sure it was from 1986.
And it was more theme-based than plot-based. They didn't exactly have a story. And then it must have only been a couple of years later, this haunting-themed episode really did have a story. They were frightened of ghosts around the house, introduced with this Spooky Stories book that Matthew has acquired. And Matthew is very anxious to convince the audience, the children, that there are no such things as ghosts. Anybody that thinks there are, it's silly, he says. He seemed often to be quite anxious. He was always telling Sooty, don't touch hot things, stay away from broken glass. And then there was this, don't be frightened of noises in the night, there are no such things as ghosts, which was really what he wanted to get across to the young audience. But it had a proper plot and structure, and it finished up with the puppet betting Matthew that he couldn't stay the night in this haunted hotel. And that's the sequence I was just talking about, where he interacts with the voice. And we love that sequence, Matthew getting frightened because Sooty and Sweep have set him up with a portrait with moving eyes and candles that light themselves and put themselves out, and a skeleton that they drop in on a string, which Matthew turns around and sees and screams and goes running out of the veranda doors. Absolutely hilarious. And then there's the little bookworm, which is so funny because it's got nothing to do with ghosts. It's making a bit of a noise in some books. He goes to see what it is, and it's this little puppet, red, furry, wormy thing that just squirts him in the face with water. Absolutely no reason, and isn't at all scary.
It's an absolutely brilliant sequence, that haunted hotel bit. I think it really got us hooked on the show. He's already gone to pick his dressing gown up off the floor once. It falls off the door again. He says it can stay there, and it moves back up to the hook of its own free will, apparently. Of course, it's really Sooty and Sweep pulling the rope, and Matthew goes, I'll pretend I didn't see that. It's like he's already convinced that the room is haunted, but he's still very keen to win his bet. The candles swapping. I feel really warm now. We always laugh about that. Absolutely excellent sequence. It's dated 1988, that episode. We've had it on video for a long time. We didn't get a video machine until the summer of 1990, so we must have recorded it on some kind of summer repeat. But we've always kept it and watched it because it's absolutely brilliant. Its title is The Unreal Ghostbusters, as opposed to The Real Ghostbusters. But we always call it Spooky Sooty or Haunted Sooty.
I've been very aware for a while now that the character we've talked about the least is Sooty. The truth is he doesn't have a voice, which means that he doesn't have as much of a character as the other 3 or even 4, counting Scampy. Scampy is also silent, but he does have more character because he's so naughty, and he will do things like help Sweep fake an illness. He's not always there, so when he is there, it's because he's really got something to do, particularly when we're still at the Sooteries rather than when we get to Sooty and Co. And you made a very interesting point about how Scampy is like Wesley from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because a character has started out in a certain way portray Giles as a very stereotypically uptight English fuddy-duddy and Sooty as a naughty little bear, and then they've developed and they've mellowed and they've become more of a protagonist and a different kind of show to maybe how it started, and then along comes another character who's just what that character used to be.
The bulk of the characterisation for Sooty and Scampy with the whispering relies on the puppeteer, and we did spot how when Matthew was puppeteering Scampy a few times in the Sooty show and Sooty and Co., Scampy did develop more kind of Sooty-like mannerisms.
Another way that Sooty is characterised is the way that whoever he's whispered to repeats what he's said. So that's something Sue can and often does do as well. She very often will lead a scene in their bedroom set, for instance. And if Sooty's got a funny line and Matthew's saying it, then it is very funny. For instance, when they're expecting little cousin Scampy and Matthew doesn't know what to expect and Sooty does, and a cricket ball has come through the window. Sooty's saying, "It's Scampy." No, it isn't Scampy. Scampy's not here. You think he probably is. The way that Matthew delivers that line is what makes it funny.
I thought a particularly good bit with Scampy, when he became more of a regular character, was where he'd been terribly naughty. He was giving everyone gifts to make up for it, honey for Sooty, bone for Sweep and stuff, and they're like, "Oh, Scampy's got a good heart, really," and he's given Matthew something to say sorry, which is obviously another joke, but Matthew doesn't realise. And then Scampy taps on the table and whispers to Matthew, and Matthew's like, "What, Scampy? You've got to go now?" And we're like, "Oh yes, we know why Scampy's got to go now. Matthew's about to be the victim of another one of his pranks."
Of course, I didn't think to mention the tapping that they do when they want to say something. It's a sort of a trademark, isn't it? A hallmark, the double tap. I'm sure you can't hear it at all, really, and they sort that out in the dub, as Craig Charles would say. Rather like the shave and a haircut, as Christopher Lloyd would say in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, rhythm of the magic wand, and the spell Izzy Wizzy Let's Get Busy. These are all familiar things that a child likes to see done regularly and that they come to understand what they mean. So Sooty or Scampy does a double tap on the table, they want to say something. You do that shave and a haircut rhythm with the wand, say the spell, and something happens. Of course, Sooty having a magic wand and being a magical bear has changed very much from when Harry Corbett was doing illusions with him.
Speaking of the tapping and the whispering, it reminds me again of the Matthew narration sequences where he's talking for Sooty or talking for Scampy. And I'm always saying to the puppets, whisper to each other, or whisper to Sweep, or whisper to Sue as well. So it's not just you're hearing what Matthew's saying and it's ostensibly what Sooty's saying. I like it when they do bother incorporating the whispering into those scenes. You mentioned the bedroom set a while ago, which is a very familiar sight to us. Obviously, it was quite new in the Haunted Sooty, Spooky Sooty from 1988, because in 1986 on Old School Weekend, we noticed they hadn't sorted out the bedroom set yet. They had kind of 3 beds in a row and some props down the front, but the bedroom set we're used to, with its different levels of Sue's little bit down the bottom, and several trapdoors and things to pop in and out of and do interesting things with, tiered up to Sooty and Sweep's beds, and then the adult can stand behind. Works very well on the screen. They seem to have sorted out their bathroom set pretty quickly by the time they make it to the Sooteries, and the bedroom and the bathroom both make it to Sooty and Co. You get different scenery through the window in the bedroom, chimney pots make you think, oh yes, we're in the middle of Manchester.
They redecorate those sets too, like the bathroom goes from blue to some green. They put up some different wallpaper on the bedroom set to make you think it's supposed to be a different house, but I don't think that really works terribly well.
Another thing coming to the Sooteries introduced was regular guest appearances of Connie Crichton. We used to reckon to see her about once per series, and I think that's about right. Her final appearance, it turned out, was actually in 1997 in the penultimate series of Sooty and Co. And she's heavily involved in one of the episodes we enjoy quite a lot from that peak 1991 series about turning the Sooteries into a guest house, where she's the paying guest who's going to come and stay with them, and she's having a tug of war over her luggage, her purse, with Sweep for most of the episode, because that's something else he's taken very literally. Matthew's told him to tape the guest luggage. grab their luggage, so Sweep is going to take Connie's luggage at all costs. And that's one of several funny sequences in that episode, including Sooty soaking the living room while trying to remove this tiny stain from the arm of the sofa, and Matthew's bath overflowing and ending up soaking him and Connie by bursting through the ceiling, and it's an absolutely tremendous episode. As well as these regular guest appearances on the telly, a huge thing Connie did for the Sooty franchise was to be in the stage shows, which toured the country for several years. Matthew says in Sooty and Co., you know, Connie Crichton, she's the lady who does the stage shows with me. And we're like, well, actually, Matthew, you do the stage shows with her for the first part of the run. And then Matthew would go off and write and start making the TV series. And for the second half of the stage show run, it would be Connie and another man, possibly different men in different venues around the country, we're not sure. But we went and saw Connie and a man on the stage with Sooty, Sweep and Sue and Scampy in St Albans.
The man's name was Spencer.
I'm pretty sure we did that 4 times in the early 90s, and we enjoyed it tremendously. And Rosie had a very lucky experience in 1992 of actually going up on stage for a bit, shaking hands with Sweep and Sue, and saying a line in a little bit that Spencer was doing.
If you were at the Alban Arena in 1992, at the performance where Spencer called down a little girl in a pretty dress, and a rather awkward little girl came down with a flowery dress on, that was me. And I was very pleased to have been chosen for that and to meet Sweep and Sue, which I wish I could remember that aspect of it better, really.
As has been mentioned, Scampy debuted on the show in 1 episode in 1990. We were discussing this time how it's no coincidence, undoubtedly, that's also when the puppets were redesigned. They've gone through a lot of redesigns over the years, and we think they do get less and less ugly as time goes on. Certainly the 1990 versions are quite sort of rounded and soft and cute looking. The ones in Haunted Sooty 1988 are quite sort of sharp and angular, I think. But you can tell they're the stage before the rounded, nice ones we're used to.
If you go further back, you can see them looking more and more crude. There's a very early clip from the Sooteries that I've seen at some stage with that original bedroom set that you described, where I did think they looked extremely crude. And that's another reason, as well as all the ones that we've just given, but not said in explicit terms, we believe we had the peak of Sooty in our childhood in the late 80s, but particularly the early 90s. Not only had Matthew sorted out the format to be at its best, but also the puppets were looking their best.
And they did really keep that style for over 10 years. There are slight modifications. Sooty loses his mouth by the end of Sooty and Co, we've noticed. But basically that 1990 puppet style does stick around until somebody comes in and deliberately makes them look awful in 2002. And of course, yes, they do match, the Sooty, Sweep and Sue puppets do match the new puppet, Little Cousin Scampy. And we were discussing this time, Little Cousin Scampy really looks at his best in the Sooteries in 1990, 1991 and 1992. The puppet looks like a cute little scamp, and by the time we get to Sooty and Co in 1993, he's lost the kind of dirty patch on his face, and he's just looking rather different and not as appealing. And they've made the puppet far too short by the time we get to Sooty and Co. You can often see a black sleeve under him. I was saying they should have put the shorts, or the beginning of the shorts on it that you can see in the cartoon version of the characters in the opening music of Sooty and Co. It adds to the effect of the school uniform. I've always liked Scampy, and that peak of 1991 really is my favourite bit, and the appearance of Scampy and the inclusion of Scampy is a big part of what makes those enjoyable, I think.
We did find some episodes on YouTube that we hadn't got on video from 1990 that we were interested in seeing, one of which was Scampy's introduction, where he turns up and behaves very naughtily, finishes up with them chasing him to this farm where he's making them slip with banana skins, and Matthew gets kicked up the bum by a horse and things like that, which we didn't think was as good as the one I described earlier, his return for the beginning of 1991, one and the spell on Matthew's hand. And this reminds me that I promised to talk about Derek. We also found Derek's original episode on YouTube from 1990, and it made a lot less sense and wasn't as good as the 1991 return of Derek. Now, I did imply earlier that Derek was a plastic bar duck. It sometimes struck me that a sentient one of these is a couple of steps further into surreality than teddy bear puppets and toy-looking panda and dog puppets. I don't approve of calling toys teddies that aren't bears. And I suppose in that introduction of Derek, Matthew acknowledges that it doesn't make an awful lot of sense either. They're all very surprised to learn that this little toy bath duck is sentient. Not unlike Sweep, he has a noise that he makes with his words. It's a quack. And what I never would have got from Derek's return is that originally he becomes attached to Sweep because he thinks Sweep is Mummy. Matthew says ducks are known for thinking other animals are their mummies. I don't think they'll latch on to anything like Derek does, and when they take him to the park to try and find his real mummy, he thinks it's this very sweet Springer Spaniel who we think belongs to Matthew because it turns up in the show a lot, including Sooty and Co. when they move to Manchester. In Derek's return episode, we are reminded that they took him to the park and he found his mummy, which is a larger, more detailed, more realistically decorated plastic duck. He met up with her and 3 other Dereks, and they just live in the park with the other dogs, and they're plastic, which is so funny. But really, I thought it was going to make more sense than he just happens to be in the Sooteries and thinking Sweep's his mother. So that and the Scampi episode really confirmed what I'd been thinking. This 1991 series is the best. When Derek returns in 1991, it starts with Sweep missing him. He's so sad that his friend Derek isn't there anymore. You never think that Derek had thought he was his mother. And then, for no particular reason, he's in their bath a few minutes into the episode. And it does make me laugh when they're back down at this breakfast bar that they do a lot of puppeteering at. And Matthew asks this little yellow plastic toy duck, "Does your mummy know where you are?" Whack! She does. Yes, obviously he has the permission of the larger, more detailed plastic duck to go and visit his friend Sweep.
And you were talking earlier about understanding Sweep through context. It also becomes possible to understand Derek quite well. In the end scene of that Derek Returns episode, Derek is in Matthew's big bath, and Matthew and Sweep are having a chat, and Derek goes, "Quack, quack," and it's very obvious he said, "Matthew," and Matthew says, "What, Derek?" And he doesn't need to translate. We've all known exactly what he said. "Matthew, what, Derek?" "I love it." "You love it?" In response to Sweep decorating the whole of Matthew's bathroom to look like Derek's home, which involves bringing in a lot of plants.
More of that taking things literally humour. We were saying that nowadays, if Sweep went to school and behaved as he does, he would be statemented. He's certainly on the autistic spectrum, although in those days I'm sure Matthew didn't realise that. He just thought it was funny characteristics for Sweep to have.
And we've talked quite a lot about the episodes we do enjoy in that 1991 series, which is a heck of a lot of it. And yeah, we decided it really was a peak, and we certainly wanted to watch it on video again. The return of Scampi, as you were saying, is better than Scampi's first episode. Scampi's sawing his way through the breakfast bar, causing all this damage. Matthew's like, "You are a little scallywag." He's more than that, really. He's very destructive and rather dangerous. You were talking about the car boot sale one. That was always a favourite, that scene with the car boot sale itself, where Sooty, Sweep and Sue have forgotten to write the location on the poster, so nobody's turned up, and Matthew ends up buying all the old things that he was giving to them to get rid of anyway. And there's a funny on-location sequence where the puppets are all crying, and Matthew's crying too. "Oh, I have to go back and buy something else." And then we cut to them back at the Sooteries with all the rubbish on the table, and Matthew going, £17, Sue, £17.
Early Christmas is an episode that was briefly mentioned. It was the shouting thing. Sue telling Matthew off for being a big shouting bully, which more parents, particularly dads, probably should take some notice of. And again, that Sweep's antics really getting saved up. I It's a bit complicated to explain how he gets to the stage of painting Sue's wrapped presents that she's organised earlier, and it's really a total accident that they end up opening them. I don't think Sweep really realises that Matthew doesn't realise they're Sue's parcels. Matthew's saying, "I love to know what's in them." "So would I," says Sweep.
"So would you."
"Well, if you want to know what's in them, there's only one thing to do, open them." "Can I?" says Sweep.
"Well, they're your boxes, Sweep. If you want to open them, let's open them."
And by then, it's really gone too far for Sweep to say, "Well, these are actually Sue's boxes, didn't you know?" So then, of course, that's what makes Matthew shout when Sue comes back and is horrified to find that they've opened her parcels. And to make up for this and lure Sweep out of hiding and apologise, Matthew dresses up as Father Christmas, does one of his amusing ad-libs. He's come in with the costume on, the sack full of presents slung over his shoulder, ho-ho-hoing, and says to the camera, "It's me, it's Matthew, I'm pretending to be Father Christmas." And then he's about to carry on and then thinks of saying, "You might have noticed." Yes, we had, actually.
Another bit we used to rewind and watch and enjoy in that episode was Matthew's assessment of this Sylvanian family's character that's supposed to be Sue's Christmas present to little cousin Scampy. Matthew takes it out of the box and goes, "Oh, look at that, it's a little person."
The next series was still at the Sooty's, 1992, which we weren't finding quite so hilarious and cleverly done.
One thing I noticed about that straight off at the time in new season September 92 was that they jazzed up the music, and they'd also done the same thing to Nightmare that year. I thought, 1992 is jazzing up the opening theme, which was really very good before, and now it's not as good. But in both cases, of course, greater change was yet to come.
Real evidence that his show's in trouble, and we think Matthew had used most of his best ideas by that time, mostly in 1991. The one with the moving toy animals, barking dogs, snuffling rabbits, etc., is a very good one because it really is a Sweep ep where he's convinced all these things are real, and he's so sweet. He's bringing buns for the elephant and carrots for the rabbit and stuff like that. And Sue really is being very mischievous in that one, teaming up with Sooty to put these toys all around the house and get them moving and convince Sweep that they're real. There's a cow at the breakfast bar that Matthew is trying to convince him is not real, and Sue is really encouraging Sweep. Yes, it must have been a real cow because it said moo, didn't it? And the way she says that reminds me, in a way, of a sort of patronising parent, but also she's being a mischievous child, so the roles are really overlapping there. She's using that position of second adult to make Sweep trust her, I suppose, and thinking these toys are real. And then the episode finishes up with Matthew saying, "It's okay, I showed Sweep where the batteries go and now he gets it," but just to show that not all fluffy things that move around are battery operated, here are some real kittens, and there are these two absolutely sweet little, very well behaved kittens just lying in their basket while Matthew sings a song and tickles them on the head and stuff.
And of course, Sweep needs the episode ending song, which is another trademark of the Sooty show on many occasions, to really get the hang of it, because his initial reaction to the kittens, the real kittens, is, "Where do the batteries go?"
Another episode from that series we enjoy, Matthew's leg is broken. It's quite funny in the hospital where he gets covered in the meal.
And before that, Scampy is just shamelessly moving his leg hoist and his bed around, just for laughs. Really can't claim Scampy's tried to do anything there other than have a laugh by making poor injured Matthew suffer.
It follows on from him replacing Matthew's chocolates they were going to bring him with joke chocolates that are extra hot, sort of spicy chocolates. But of course there was some reasoning behind that. They'd, between them, the three boys, eaten the real chocolates they were going to bring him, so it's to replace them, and they just happened to be joke chocolates.
And Sooty in that one does get to fire the fire hose at Matthew to cool his mouth down after eating the joke chocolate. Again, Sooty does get overlooked at times when talking about these episodes. There's something memorable and useful but mischievous that he did.
But of course what really makes us collapse with laughter is Matthew's home help, Brenda Blunder, after he's home again, obviously. Brenda Longman would play a character. For instance, she's someone who plays bowls and embarrasses Matthew with it in a 1991 episode. On a Remembering Clip show, when it was Sooty's 40th birthday, she was briefly in a clip turning up as a salesperson at the door. And in 1992, in this hospital episode, she was Brenda Blunder, the home help who is completely clumsy and terrible at her job. When she comes in, she puts the door knocker and the doorknob on the breakfast bar, saying, "I'm afraid I've pulled your knob off and your knocker." Assumes that the puppets are the people she's come to help. And then when Matthew calls her over, she says, "Oh, it's you, is it?" and goes and crashes into him, and they fall on the floor. And then she gets out her Brenda Blunder's Blended Bliss, which Matthew can't say. Blender Blunder, he will say, and it's a very nice sounding meal that she's mushed up all together in a blender and put in some Tupperware, and when she's trying to feed it to him, she sneezes and smushes it into his face. And then he does the same thing to her with her other bowl of Blended Bliss, and that's the end of the episode, and they're both standing there laughing at what fun they've had filming it.
That was another sequence we used to rewind and watch several times if we were watching the tape crew. Brenda Blunder. It was interesting, we spotted it was in that series that Sally Corbett, Matthew's wife, started being credited with the puppeteers in some episodes. She was around all through Sooty and Co. Obviously, they realised at times they would need 4 puppeteers for 4 puppets, particularly if Matthew wasn't doing one of them, principally Sooty at the time. Of course, Matthew's children were never interested in joining the show and taking over the show because they had their own lives to lead. It's interesting on the Sooty show when Matthew mentions things like My Little Boy. He had this toy when he was little and now he's doing a degree. And it's like, that's an interesting fantasy reality mix. Matthew's talking about himself as the real Matthew, or Peter Corbett there, with his real family. Whereas in the sitcom, you wouldn't particularly think he had a little boy living in the Sooteries with Sooty, Sweep and Sue. Another notable episode in that 92 series is Sooty's 40th birthday, as they call it. It's the 40th anniversary of him appearing on television. You were mentioning the look-back video from that. Rod, Jane and Freddie turn up, and Matthew explains there how Sooty has 2 ages. They always say he's 5, but actually he's much older than that. And he compares it to Peter Pan, and saying, "Oh, Peter Pan is always 5 years old." Well, as anyone who's listened to our recent Golden Age of Disney podcast knows, Peter Pan certainly isn't perpetually 5 years old. As was explained there, he's perpetually 12 or 13 years old, and will help others over the threshold to becoming older than that.
Sooty isn't really ever sexualised like Peter Pan, except possibly when he was kissing Sweep at the boxing ring. But I still think he's more mature than 5. I never liked that, Sooty's 5. I think it would be better not to put an age on it, just say he's always a child.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Thames Television lost its ITV franchise in 1992, which was a big turning point in many ways. It meant the end of Rainbow after 20 years, for one thing, and there were some terrible failed attempts to relaunch that later in the 90s, which are far better not talked about. And quite a few ITV shows had to have new production companies. Thames Television did still do some television production for a while, like The Tomorrow People. For us, it meant when we were watching regional ITV, it was no longer, well, Thames Television, it was you're watching Carlton Television for London. But another thing it meant was that the Sooty show finished, really, or at least evolved into Sooty and Co. with Granada Television up in Manchester, and they made it next to Coronation Street Studios production area. They often had guests from Coronation Street in Sooty and Co. because it was easy, and they were celebrity guests that the viewers would probably recognise, or enough of the viewers would recognise to make it worth doing. We were discussing some of the reasons why Granada and Matthew would have wanted to do Sooty and Co. rather than just carry on the Sooty show in some way. As you were saying, Matthew's best ideas really had run out, and perhaps the idea of the shop setting was to allow for some new comedy situations involving working in the shop and trying to run the shop, which was rather unsuccessful and never really had any customers. Their one regular customer, Brenda Longman, in her regular role as Mo from Market, always came in and never bought anything. thing and often used to flog them stuff instead. And I suppose, in a way, it did successfully spin out the whole sitcom concept for another 6 years, but I don't think either of us had ever really liked Sooty and Co. as much as the Sooty show. And not just because we were getting older into teenage as we were watching Sooty and Co.
I think it's quite likely that Granada wanted a new title, and perhaps from there Matthew had the idea of a shop. I'm sure it was his idea because he had complete creative control, and I think probably the most interesting episodes are the ones where the shop really is used. A lot of sequences and ideas were happening that he might have thought of back at the Sootery, such as everyone having a security blanket that they were stealing from each other and getting embarrassed by and all kinds of things, which wasn't nearly as good as Sweep and his car boot sale and Derek and all that stuff. And then using the shop was a bit different, which some children might not like very much. They don't always like change, children, do they? But it does allow for some new ideas, and really the funniest thing in Sooty and Co. is the TV advert that they make for the shop, isn't it?
That was another rewind and rewatch moment, probably the only one in Sooty and Co., and it is very funny.
Sooty and Scampy are doing that one. Sue's making a radio advert and Sweep is sticking some letters on a banner to try and make it say come to Sooty's shop and get them in the wrong order. And Sooty and Scampy get Matthew to record a voiceover for the advert. Of course they can't do it themselves. And they don't chop off the bit at the beginning where he doesn't realise they're recording and he's chuckling over Cos Tooty Poo Smesh, which is what Sweep's got on his banner, and saying, oh, sorry, are we recording? We like how he's saying prices are rock bottom and the bears are sticking the camera up close to his bent over bottom, and then their friendly staff are there to help, and they've got Sue getting tangled up in her recording tape saying, what are you lot doing here? Why don't you just push off?
Which is what it's like when you go into many shops and try to get the staff to help you. It should be really good for little cousin Scampy Sooty and Co., where he finally becomes a full-fledged member of the awesome foursome of puppets. As I say, the puppet itself, I think, isn't as good in Sooty and Co., and they even forget all about him in one of those early episodes that we kept on video from 1993, Bubbles and Balloons one.
Again, something that could have been done at the Sooteries and would have been much less engaging than all that hilarious 1991 stuff.
Another one we used to enjoy from that first Sooty & Co. series in '93 was Matthew being captain organisation and organising himself this barge trip on his own. And that's going back to that humour of Matthew boasting and getting egg on his face. Sue has to answer the phone all the time. Matthew's in trouble, sends Sooty and Sweep in the camper van to go and sort things out for Matthew. He's run out of fuel. He can't open the lock gate. Bit we particularly always loved in that one was Sue going, Matthew couldn't organise a jam sandwich, and Matthew then claims to us to have organised himself a jam sandwich, then talks for a bit, tries to eat his jam sandwich and says, I've forgotten to put the butter and the jam in, and throws it into the canal the ducks will enjoy. So of course Sue was right, he couldn't organise a jam sandwich. It's interesting, that's one of the rare occasions when Matthew actually includes Butch in the show, in a dream sequence as a pirate of the high canals. So Matthew and the puppets still do some good stuff in Sooty and Co., and we did keep watching and enjoying it.
A strange thing about Sooty and Co. is that Sooty had his hammer back again and did hit Matthew on the head with it, which I'm pretty sure didn't happen at all after the ban up until after they left the Sootery, so I don't know what made Granada TV think that children weren't going to kill their parents with hammers. Hopefully none of them ever did.
Matthew actually sold the rights to Sooty in 1996, according to the wiki, only for £1.5 million, and we think he vastly undersold it, don't we, even in those days. But really, it's none of our business what he sold it for. But obviously, as part of the deal, he wasn't going to retire immediately. He still worked on Sooty and presented Sooty & Co. for another couple of years, and retired, as I said earlier, when he was 50. And with all the hard work, videos, stage shows, TV shows, going around schools and things that Matthew had been doing for 20 years, we can't blame him for thinking that that was a reasonable time to call it a day. Of course, the unfortunate thing about it was that it really did start a kind of sequence of decay in the Sooty franchise that meant that within 5 years of Matthew leaving the show, Sooty was off air for the first time in just over 50 years, and that's no coincidence. Apparently Matthew did handpick Richard Cadell from the group of hopefuls to be the main guy to replace him, to be the right hand behind Sooty. And under some circumstances that we're not sure of, Matthew was probably involved to some extent. Liana Bridges was chosen as well, and Richard and Liana were going to be the new presenters. And Richard and Liana do appear regularly in the final series of Sooty & Co. in 1998, and we see slightly less of Matthew, but he's still the main presenter.
They seem to be thinking at that stage that Sooty & Co. would continue. Richard and Liana have come to work at Sooty & Co., and when Matthew is off at the end, it's because he's going to open another branch.
When we were watching Harry Corbett doing Sooty, it really struck me how Matthew had obviously studied and admired his father's technique of doing the puppetry and had incorporated some aspects of it into his own performance, but it was also Matthew doing his own thing. The criticism we always had of Richard was that he was copying Matthew too much, trying to recreate that exact interaction with Sooty, and I think that is certainly true. That doesn't change the fact that Richard obviously cares about Sooty a great deal and has tried over the years to keep him in the public eye, and in 2008 managed to buy the rights to Sooty when they came up for sale, so that he's then been able over the past 10 years or so to do more with the character, which is a good thing really, because Sooty is one of these things that can just run and run in some way and be as charming and amusing and entertaining as it ever was to every new generation, even though it'll never hit the peak of the 1991 Sooty show. One thing that happened after Matthew had sold the rights to Sooty and still worked on the thing for a couple of years was that we did finally see him on stage, not in St Albans, because he still wasn't doing the stage show in St Albans, but by specially going to a performance in London. And as I remember it, Matthew was making quite a few jokes in that about, oh, I've sold the company.
Perhaps he wasn't really very sorry when he got heckled by our dad.
And I'm sure it's no coincidence that it was just after Matthew had sold the company that they made 2 series of the Sooty cartoon. Cosgrove Hall actually animated that. On our Cosgrove Hall podcast, I said quite erroneously that Avenger Penguins was really the last thing they produced for CITV. There were other things, including this amazing Adventures of Sooty in 97 and 98. And it was a strange one, really. I was saying the opening sequence to Sooty & Co. was kind of a prototype or backdoor pilot with cartoon versions of the characters. But this Sooty cartoon, anyway, was a bit weird. We watched it. It was about Sooty, Sweep and Sue and Scampy having back-in-time adventures by going through a trapdoor in this theatre they were working at. And there was this cat character called Katerina who was in charge of the theatre, owned the theatre, and was the sort of adult character who would come and tell them off, possibly antagonise them in some way. The thing that Sooty purists might well not like about it was that Sweep and Scampy spoke normal, audible English. But then in a cartoon series like that, it wouldn't really be possible just to have Sue of the main quartet speaking clear, audible English. In many ways, I've always thought it would be less incongruous if they had Sooty speaking as well, but that was a taboo even the cartoon wouldn't break. Now, after 1998, the problem Sooty experienced, it appears, is that quite a few different companies were buying in, backing out, putting in creative decisions all over the place, and it never really found its feet after Matthew. As you said, we were really expecting Sooty & Co. Series 7 with Richard and Liana in September 1999, and obviously when Matthew left, that was what he was expecting, Richard and Liana were expecting. Perhaps there were no other plans afoot at that time. But what we actually got in September 1999 was Sooty Heights, at which point we joked that, whenever the characters on these things don't know what to do next, they open a hotel. They find they can't face life anymore, and then they open a hotel, like Basil and Sybil Fawlty.
An example of a show that really did that, went for a while and then opened a hotel, is Harry's Mad.
And I was trying to think of other examples as well as Harry's Mad, and I'm not sure what else we were really thinking about. But it did remind us of Harry's Mad in that way. But like the shop, the hotel setting does provide new opportunities for interacting with guests, doing things around the hotel.
I seem to remember that those two series of Sooty Heights were perfectly watchable, and it was one of those where Brian Blessed came along to get absolutely covered in what they call custard pies and read a script that someone wanted him to do and laugh at it and say, if I'd done this, no one would have ever taken me seriously again, and he's all covered in stuff.
Yes, it was perfectly good, perfectly watchable, Sooty Heights. Obviously, a constant drawback was it wasn't Matthew, it was Richard and Liana, but as I remarked while writing about it at one point for my Nightmare fanzine, the puppets have lost nothing. And I suppose that's true in many ways. It was Sooty and Sweep, Scampy and Sue, doing their best to take good care of you at Sooty Heights, which obviously a lot of the time wouldn't have been very good care at all, and hilarity would have ensued. They even tried in Sooty Heights to have Brenda Longman, instead of playing Mo, playing a kind of semi-regular character called Dottie, who also owned a hotel in the local area, a sort of possibly colleague, possibly business rival. I'm not sure what they tried to do with her, and I don't think she ended up being in it that much. They didn't find the idea very sustainable. But it did help to add to the sense that, yes, here's Sooty, this is the successor to Sooty & Co. It's similar in some ways. One interesting thing I noticed about Sooty Heights when I was having a flick through a bit recently was that Scampy finally gets a bed in that bedroom set we were talking about earlier. Kind of ironic, really, because Scampy, after those two series of Sooty Heights, was destined to be sidelined in a big way. It was quite a surprise in September 2001 when Sooty came back and we were expecting Sooty Heights Series 3. It was still set in the hotel, somewhat redecorated in rather unnecessarily vivid colours, but I'm sure at times in that series, that third series of Sooty Heights, or that first series of Sooty Heights, but not Sooty Heights, Richard does actually refer to the hotel as Sooty Heights, even though it's not the title anymore. And then someone spots that, and in the next two series that they plopped out, it's Sooty's Hotel. But again, it's a symptom of different executives, different companies coming in and out of it and thinking they know how to change it for the better. The first thing we noticed in 2001 was that instead of the perfectly reasonable Sooty Heights theme tune, it had a ridiculous new theme tune and the title Sooty at the end of it, with apparently regular appearances from Butch and this new character, Mickey the cat from Brazil, who come to be the hotel chef.
You might not realise Mickey is a girl, but she is. You know, in our update podcast recently, I was talking about that stupid Grange Hill theme with the stupid ketchup. Jake and I recently watched all the Happy Days openings, and the original one is full of stupid hijinks, including stupid ketchup. That silly song succeeding Sooty Heights may not have literally had ketchup, but it had stupid food and the lyric, Scampy's cooking something very smelly.
To rhyme with Butch has dropped his collar in the jelly, which is very like silly ketchup.
I certainly remember thinking, what the hell is this? But then the show itself didn't seem to have been damaged, and I, for one, was not sorry to see Liana replaced with Vicky Lee Taylor. I have tried to find out whether Liana wanted to go or was made to go, and it seems she was made to go, suddenly fired, she said. It's written somewhere more tactfully, her contract was not renewed, which is a shame and kind of sexist because you could just fire people in those days for being a woman, and you'd rather have a different woman. Personally, I prefer to watch Vicky Lee Taylor. I quite enjoyed her in that one series of Sooty that I watched her in, and I have been enjoying her in one of the title roles in Big Meg, Little Meg. And she was there at the hotel, coming along with a folder full of art stuff, saying she'd been to college and wanted to talk to Uncle Richard about this and that.
I think it's pretty safe to infer that Richard had more of an ironclad contract than Leona, as he was handpicked as Matthew's favourite. As you say, it's rather sexist. But as you also said, he didn't seem too damaging when we first watched that series. Yes, it had the silly new music, but in many ways it was still Sooty Heights, as it should be. Scampy did start to get very sidelined there, which I thought was a shame. If you watch that silly opening, you can actually kind of see, here are the four main puppets you're going to see: Sooty, Sweep, Sue and Mickey in these stars. And yes, occasionally there'll also be Scampy and Butch, and I'm sure we saw lots more Butch than we did of Scampy. But on the whole, it wasn't too bad. I was looking at the closing credits, and interestingly, as well as Sue's voice, Brenda Longman, they had started crediting Sweep's voice, Brian Sanford, and I thought, that's interesting. We know that Brian Sanford has been on the list of puppeteers since the Sooty show in the Sooteries. Obviously, he's been doing Sweep all that time, more than 10 years. And at that stage, Brenda Longman had been doing Sue for 20 years, 1981 to 2001. But then, when Sooty returned with the same opening sequence in 2002, again with Richard and Vicky, Brenda Longman wasn't there. And Sue was being voiced by someone else, and Butch was suddenly being voiced by Francis Wright, and all the puppeteers have been replaced. We assumed at the time Brenda Longman may have walked out in disgust at what the show had become. But actually, given that all the puppeteers were gone, including Brian Sanford, obviously tenure meant nothing at that point, and somebody, some company, some executive had decided, well, let's replace all the puppeteers and completely redesign the puppets, and no longer credit Sue's voice, Sweep's voice, Butcher's voice, but just write up puppeteers, which may have been some sort of attempt to be a bit retro with it, go back to the show's roots, as we think might be making the puppets in 2002 look like absolute garbage.
I remember being horrified to see that and to hear someone who sounded kind of like it might be a man doing Sue's voice, but it wasn't. Her name was Sheila something. Not only that, I seem to remember they were talking infantile nonsense. It's hard for me to remember now, but I feel quite certain I gave up on that after no more than one whole episode. It was dumbed down, as I've just implied, which is strange in a way because I seem to remember from the previous series a sequence where Sue and Mickey were dancing around to some sort of pop music, and I was thinking, are they trying to make it cool? Are they trying to appeal to older children who think they're teenaged? And then suddenly, next series, it's all infantile and insulting to go with the music and the stupid jelly.
I think it really is a case of too many cooks spoiling the broth, and in the end, burning and having to throw out the broth. One thing about that Sue voice I was theorising this time, having had a look and a listen on YouTube, was that maybe they thought it sounded rather more like Marjorie Corbett and were trying to go back to the show's roots or olden days in that way. Trouble is, as everybody knows, Brenda Longman is a far better voice for Sue because she doesn't sound like an emphysemic old woman, and this Sheila woman did sound like that even if she wasn't actually that.
Brenda Longman had been doing it for so long, to get rid of her was just the wrong thing, and Richard Cadell knows that because he got her back again when he was rebooting Sooty.
I was flicking through the first episode of the third and final series of that Sooty's Hotel, Sooty Heights, but not Sooty Heights, and despairing at the background role of Scampy. It was an episode about April Fool's Day, which at one point is said to be Scampy's birthday, and it's the day when he should be absolutely in his element. He was there, but he was hanging around. Nobody was really acknowledging him. And he was trying to help Butch play a trick on Sooty and Sweep. And I thought that really epitomised the background role and the very poor use of Scampy that's in those series, which is just one of many things about them that was terrible. And obviously, ITV executives agreed, because after the series that ended at the very beginning of 2004, Sooty was off air for the first time in just over 50 years. It was heartening to hear on Bargain Hunt and the Weakest Link Puppet Special in about 2007, Brenda Longman back as Sue, looking like the nice, round, not ugly puppet that we were so used to. And indeed, Brenda Longman as Sue won that Weakest Link Puppet Special in 2007. Roland Rat had his chance to win, but messed up the question, and Sue swept in for the win. And after Richard did buy the rights in 2008 and very much get Brenda back on board and launch some new stage shows and get CITV to agree to fund shows, the new episodes set in a holiday camp with Richard trying to organise it, the unseen boss always on his back, a bit like Ed and Oucho's excellent invention. I think that was really a good thing, because it was a shame not to have something on the telly for so long. And as I say, I think he is rather evergreen and always entertaining, and Richard obviously cares about him a great deal, so I'm glad he's managed to make those 3 series over the last 11 years and do some stage shows and merchandise and things. And who knows what we might see from Richard and Sooty in the future, but they always are a welcome sight. A lot of things don't end when they should and stay past their use-by date, and we say, oh, what's that still doing on? But with Sooty being such a national institution, to see him, Sweep and Sue as well, Scampy maybe, hopefully, somewhere in the public eye getting some sort of exposure is always a good thing, I think, because Sooty does have a timeless appeal. As he is, as you were saying earlier, the perpetual child in all of us, rather than the perpetual pubescent in all of us like Peter Pan. The particular episode in Richard's relaunch series in 2011 that we did make a point of watching is the one where Matthew is there, guest starring in the episode, and it's well worth watching. Matthew turning up at the holiday camp with Matt's Snacks, his new job, and interacting with Sooty, Sweep and Sue and Richard again, and being his good old entertaining self.
Saying to the audience, if you don't know who I am, ask your mum and dad, which very well a lot of children might have done, and their mum and dad would remember Matthew with great fondness, I'm sure.
So there we are, plenty of thoughts and information and opinions about Sooty, and as I say, who knows what we may see of him, or hear of him, ironically, in future. The Olden Days podcast is now going to take a break while we attempt to move house. And our plan is to come back refreshed and finish off a list of several more podcasts that we want to do in 2023. The next podcast we're planning is an update podcast, which I don't see any reason shouldn't be released on New Year's Day 2023, which is a Sunday, in which we'll talk to you about Jurassic World Dominion after its delayed release, and perhaps some other thoughts about other things that have occurred to us in the meantime. And then we'll let you know when and what we'll be talking about in 2023. So hopefully, in the meantime, we'll all enjoy a little rest from the Olden Days podcast and come back refreshed then. So until, I don't see why it shouldn't be, New Year's Day 2023.
Good night out there.
Whatever you are.